But he's aligned himself with Theresa May in response to the chemical attacks in Salisbury. But he's continued to have this commitment to really striking a bond with Putin. So it's hard to know where that will go, but it will certainly be a very important part of the conversation that he has at Chequers with the Prime Minister. And then, of course, they'll talk about the Middle East. They'll talk about Yemen. They will talk about Syria. And they will especially talk about Iran's role in the region. Because, again, despite the Iran deal, there's a broader question of Iran where there is some alignment on foreign policy objectives.
And Mark Shanahan, Donald Trump was asked at that Brussels news conference earlier about whether allies had expressed any concern to him about his discussions with President Putin in Helsinki that are coming up in a few days' time. And he said, no, they said it was a really good thing that he was going to talk to Vladimir Putin. But do you think that he will bring up the issue of the Novichok poisonings, for example, if Theresa May raises that with him?
I'm sure she will raise it with him and will push that very hard. A British citizen lost their life this week, probably through a Russian operation. Donald Trump likes to be loved wherever he goes. He's going to sit down with Putin, he's going to have this very private conversation with him, and I think it'll be a little bit more of a mutual loving. I don't think that we should be relying on Donald Trump to be raising the ideas of Novichok, of what's gone on in Salisbury. He's not going to do that on our behalf. He's a bit of the big strong man's club. He spent most of yesterday with Erdogan of Turkey, and as he said himself before he left Brussels today, he sees the Putin meeting as probably the easiest day that he'll have in this week of travels.
And we've seen Canada being a prime example, Leslie, that we can't expect President Trump to be kind, if you like, to his traditional allies.
No, that's right. But again, if you walk back to the Russia issue, it's actually very complicated. Remember that despite the interest in a personal relationship, that the president backed up the UK very strongly in terms of this particular response to the beginning of some protests, perhaps, to the chemical attacks. He took a hard line on sanctions. He expelled a number of Russian diplomats from the United States. He has said that when he goes to Russia, he will talk about elections meddling. There's a real concern on the back of the NATO summit as to whether he will also give a nod towards perhaps retreating in terms of America's commitment to NATO's role in the Baltic states. That, I think, is a potentially very problematic conversation which would really divide the United Kingdom and the United States.
And clearly a lot of people are worried about what he will say post the Putin meeting that might have an impact on what's been said about the NATO summit, right, which ended earlier today. Just as I'm speaking to you, there's a small protest over to my right. Literally just a couple of people at this stage with Free Palestine placards, holding Free Palestine placards, but clearly tomorrow is the big day.
Yes.
In terms of the protests. Let's talk about the overall relationship, and clearly it's a very long and enduring one between the UK and the US, and clearly people tomorrow, they will want to protest Donald Trump as an individual for many reasons, whether it's about his environmental policies, whether it's about his decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, whether it's about his relationships with women and his policies on women. Do you think that the relationship, though, transcends all of the difficulties that people have with this individual, Mark?
Yeah, the relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States is as strong as ever. The United States is a fantastic country. He's not making it great again, it is already great. And it's good that we can share in that greatness. We need to divorce this, as I've called him before, a deeply flawed individual from not just the office of the presidency, but as representative of the United States people. He possibly represents a significant portion of 62 million who voted for him.
As such, you're saying it's right that he's here?
I think it is right that he's here. He's been to many other countries around the world. We would have looked very, very odd if he hadn't come here, but equally, everybody who comes out on the streets tomorrow is absolutely right to be getting out and expressing their views about this president and all the things that you say, his racism, his misogyny, the strange way that he handles foreign policy as well. All of these individual cases add up to somebody who possibly shouldn't be president, but has been voted on and is going to be around here for a while.
And do you think we're going to see him staying sort of largely on message, as it were, Leslie, while he's here?
I think he will.
Given those earlier Brexit comments.
I think he will. I think when he's with Theresa May, when he's with the Queen, I think he's very much looking forward to this meeting with the Queen. Remember that the majority of those individuals in the United Kingdom polled don't think he should be meeting with the Queen. They think he should be visiting but not meeting. But for Donald Trump, I think this is possibly, the sweetest spot in this particular visit. But it's a grand visit. It is undoubtedly complicated. The relationship is multi-layered. But people in the UK are differentiating. If you look at the polls, they're differentiating between their views of the American president and their views of America and Americans. And so I think that's very significant. But nobody's quite sure what it is that Donald Trump wants. Is he playing a hard game? Is he using language that's very difficult in Europe, in the region, globally, because he really wants to upend the international order? Or is it a bargaining position? And I think that this is, one of these things that nobody's quite sure about. They're tremendously unsettled. The protesters are unsettled about, many of the things that are going on in America, and the president's propensity to dip into domestic British politics in what's seen as being a very inappropriate way, in a way that doesn't respect the rights and the ethnicities and the religions of all people. So that's clearly what's going on in those protests. But it's just a tremendously complicated visit, but it's a very important one.
Okay, Dr. Leslie Binjamuri and Dr. Mark Shanahan, for the moment, thank you very much for your thoughts on this visit. So the President now at Winfield House, the US Ambassador's residence, beyond that security cordon behind me, spending a few hours here before he goes to Blenheim Palace, the birthplace of Sir Winston Churchill, one of his heroes, and my colleague Christian Fraser is there. Christian, tell us what awaits President Trump this evening.
Well, we're just on the eastern edge of the Cotswolds, just outside the pretty village of Woodstock, which neighbours Blenheim Palace. Not the most glamorous backdrop that we've ever had, but I think it does underline the extent of the security. So all the way down the A44 here, you have a policeman standing guard every 100 metres, police drafted in from all around the country. We've not seen many protesters while we've been here, to be honest, but what we have seen just about half an hour ago was the entourage that follows President Trump. Don't think because this is not a full state visit that it's low-key. Quite the reverse. Wherever the president goes, there is always a huge entourage. It's like the court of King Henry rolling into town. So we saw around 30 vehicles going down the A44, including the Beast, the 7-seater limousine, the armoured limousine that he travels in when he is overseas. So they tell me that there are around 750 hotel rooms that have been booked this week. There are 6 helicopters, 2 planes that have followed him in, and also, of course, the Secret Service and the bag carrier, the man who carries the numbers, the nuclear codes. He will be with him as well. And all of them going to Blenheim Palace, which you quite rightly say, of course, is the birthplace of Sir Winston Churchill. He was born here in 1874. He grew up here, spent a lot of his time here, and no doubt tonight when President Trump comes here, he'll see the long library where Sir Winston wrote some of his books, some of his articles, and also did quite a lot of painting as well. We know, of course, that the bust of Winston Churchill has now been moved back into the Oval Office. So I'm sure that Mr. Trump will like the history of that and probably some of the pomp as well. Okay, it's not all the glitz and the glamour that you would associate with a state visit, but the household division will be there tonight. So the Scots Guards, the Welsh and Irish Guards will play a medley of songs when he arrives, and then there will be a black tie dinner attended not only by the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the newly appointed Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, of course, who's replaced his friend Boris Johnson, but also 150 CEOs from some of the biggest companies in the UK that also have trade links with the United States. So the likes of Jess Staley, for instance, the Chief Executive of Barclays, Richard Nodd, the European boss of Goldman Sachs. Interestingly, Baroness Martha Lane Fox, who is the founder, of course, of LastMinute.com, she was invited but has turned down her invitation. She said, I can quite understand why the government has to entertain Donald Trump, but I don't have to.
And Christian, you talk about the president meeting business leaders later. No surprise that the International Trade Secretary was one of the party greeting him when he arrived at Stansted Airport a little earlier. How much do you think excuse me, Theresa May will hope that this evening's dinner will oil the wheels, if you like, of her discussion at Chequers, her country residence, tomorrow with Donald Trump, because clearly she would love to get things moving towards some sort of bilateral trade agreement post-Brexit.
Yes, and I think she'll want the business leaders that are in the room tonight to impress on the president how important free trade is, particularly when it comes to steel and aluminium. Interesting, Tata Steel not going to be here tonight. They're now labouring under 25% tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed. So this will set the backdrop, if you will, the focal point for what the discussions will be tomorrow, namely security, but also trade, and of course that bilateral trade deal that they hope to secure post-Brexit. But there's one thing that we've already seen during this trip to Brussels, and that is that the president is highly unpredictable. He's already said on the margins of the NATO summit that he doesn't think what the government has put on the table, the common rule book, is in keeping with the spirit of the referendum. And if he says that publicly tomorrow, then of course it is going to be of some embarrassment to the Prime Minister, who's already facing opposition from within her own party.
And just briefly, Christian, I think where you're standing, where I'm standing, it illustrates, doesn't it, that during this visit, despite Trump officials and despite the UK government saying that the president isn't deliberately being kept away from protests, it illustrates us that the locations where